In this installment, my mini series that I'm calling we're going to talk about choice of law clauses. If you missed my last video, my contract basics video, go watch it. Why would you miss it? But you may not have learned that I'm doing a little mini thing called where I talk about some often terms that we will like to see in contracts, typically boilerplate language that we'll see kind of at the end of a contract, but we almost always see them in there. I'm going to explain what do these things mean, which is why it's called because I often find myself saying that when I'm reviewing contracts, like, what does this say? What is this trying to say? Anyway, what do these things mean? How do they affect us or this agreement, this contract that we're getting into? And choice of law is probably one of my favorite contract terms, contract clauses. You might be saying, Aiden, that's weird. Choice of law? Why would that be one of your favorite clauses? And I'm just a really big fan of choice. I'm very pro-choice. And sometimes we're not given the opportunity to choose things all the time. That's why I love contracts in general, is because, we get to choose what we're agreeing to, what we're going to enter into. How is this choice going to affect my life? Do I really want to enter into this contract? Is this going to change everything for me? Anyway, we get to choose things, and choice is cool. Before we get into it, be sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. All right, so choice of law, often also called governing law. You might see the two used interchangeably in the headings of these clauses or these paragraphs in a contract. What is a choice of law clause? What would it usually look like? Sometimes there's a lot more to it, but at its core, at its basics, it will say something like, this contract shall be governed by the laws of the state of X. Typically, when I'm writing them, because I am licensed in Colorado, they might say, this contract shall be governed by the laws of the state of Colorado. Simple enough. Choice of law or governing law, it allows the parties to this contract to agree on which state's laws are going to govern and interpret how this contract is enforced. If there's a dispute between us and we have to go to court about it, is the court going to apply the laws of state A or state B? Because not all states are the same. They don't treat contract or contractual obligations in the same way all the time. And so sometimes it might be beneficial for one party to have the governing law of this state, whereas another party might want it to be governed by a different state. But the point is, we get to choose which law we want to apply to the enforcement and interpretation of this contract. So does that mean you can just pick any old random state and have it apply to your contract, govern your contract, even if you have absolutely nothing to do with that state? Usually not, no. Lots of big major corporations have Delaware as their governing law for many of their contracts. Typically, this is because the corporations are often also organized in Delaware, like they're formed in Delaware, but also Delaware, for the most part, is pretty business friendly in their court processes and stuff, and their laws are pretty business friendly. So these big corporations like that business friendliness of Delaware, so they want Delaware to govern their contracts. So does that mean we should all be using Delaware as governing law in our contracts? No. Unless you're actually in Delaware or your company is formed in Delaware, there's usually really no reason for us little guys to use Delaware as governing law. For many states, there has to be some connection to that state in order to have the governing law be enforceable there. So either one of the parties should be located in that state, or the transaction took place in that state, or a governing law provision might be rejected if it's against public policy, for example. So typically we can't just pick a state at random and have that be our governing law if there's zero connection to that state. Most often, if both parties are in the same state, let's say you're working with me, I'm in Colorado, you're in Colorado, most of my contracts have Colorado governing law because that's where my business is based and that's where you're based. So if both parties are in the same state, it behooves everybody typically to have that state be the governing law or the choice of law. And usually if the contract is silent on it, so if there isn't a governing law or choice of law clause, if both parties are in that state, then that state's just going to kind of apply anyway. But if that's not the case, if the parties aren't in the same state, then that's up for negotiation. Typically, who's ever is drafting, providing the contract, typically this might be like the service provider or whoever's selling the thing and providing the contract. They'll usually have the governing law of their state because they're presumably familiar with their state's laws. They want those laws to apply to this contract. That's not always going to be beneficial or ideal for the other party, and sometimes this can be negotiated, but choice of law isn't usually a huge deal breaker in contract negotiations. Of course, the laws are going to be different, but overall, they're not so vastly different that we're gonna end this deal. We're going to say never mind and walk away if we can't agree on choice of law or governing law. You may also see, along with governing law or choice of law, you might also see language related to jurisdiction and or venue for the contract. The governing law is the law that will be applied in the interpretation of this contract. Which state's laws will be used to decide the merits of this case? That's the choice of law or governing law. Forum, venue, jurisdiction language, that discusses where will this thing be decided. So that's what's also fun about these kind of choice of law clauses. We get to decide not just which state will apply to the enforcement and interpretation of this contract, but where actually will this take place. And it doesn't have to be the same. It usually is, but it doesn't have to be. We can have governing law as Colorado, but the jurisdiction would be in California. So we'd have a California court applying Colorado law to interpret and enforce this contract. We might also see language about venue, which is usually like, will this be in a federal court? Sometimes these clauses get real detailed. Often the governing law clauses, at least with my clients and the ones that I write, they are very simple. They will say something like, this contract shall be governed by the laws of the state of Colorado. That's it. Simple enough, easy to understand. This contract will be governed and interpreted and enforced in accordance with Colorado. But it, again, can go on, and it can specify the forum, jurisdiction, venue. It really can get pretty detailed. But typically, in kind of just normal everyday contracts, it's not going to be that overboard. These choice of law clauses are often overlooked. Not much attention is paid to them, and that's kind of rightfully so. I mean, especially if it's just a simple, this thing's going to be governed by the laws of whatever state. There's not much to read into there. But as a general principle, you should never, never, never disregard anything in a contract. Never just assume something that's in a contract doesn't matter. If it didn't matter, it wouldn't be in there. Someone put it in there for a purpose. There is a reason that we put choice of law in this contract. So don't just gloss over it as if it means nothing. Ideally, even better, you would have a lawyer review that contract before you sign it or write it for you before you present it to your client or another party, so that you then have a full understanding of what exactly is this contract saying. What are all of these terms saying? What am I agreeing to if I agree to this contract? So of course, whether you need a contract for your own business or if you're presented with a contract from somebody else, it is always best to work with an attorney, have an attorney draft the contract and or review the contract for you, so you know exactly what you're getting into. That's all for this episode of All Up in Your Business and part 2 of Choice of Law. If you learned a thing or two, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And of course, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time.